So I would like to kick it off with our panel today. Welcome everyone. It's a delight to see you all today for our panel. As you all know, today we celebrate 5 years of the GDPR, but still privacy is a growing concern for many individuals, users, consumers, specifically about tracking the activities across websites, tracking the activities across apps, and using this for advertising purpose. But on the other hand, we see the emergence of privacy-enhancing technologies, PETs, and they present a unique opportunity to mitigate privacy risks, also to streamline compliance, and also establish trust in digital technology. And I'm really thrilled to discuss the topic of privacy through innovation, privacy-enhancing technologies, consumer protection, and the online ads ecosystem with the panelists today. On my right, we have Marie-Paule Benassi. Marie-Paule is the head of the Unit E3 for Consumer Enforcement and Redress at the European Commission DG Just. She works for the European Commission for over 11 years in various positions, but always a focus on consumer protection. And now she heads the Cookie Pledge Initiative, and we're looking forward to hearing more. Welcome, Marie-Paule. We also have, on the right side, we have Christian Reimsbach, who is an information economist and policy analyst at the OECD Directorate for Science, Tech and Innovation. And he is the pen holder of the Privacy Enhancing Technology Report of the OECD. We're really looking forward to hearing more about this. To mention, you are with the OECD for over 15 years, so lots of experience. Welcome, Christian. On my left side, we have Anthony Chavez. He is a vice president for product management at Google and is leading the Privacy Sandbox initiative for Google's platforms and ecosystem teams. He started his career at Google over 12 years ago, and before that he worked at Microsoft for over 15 years, so tons of technical engineering experience. Welcome, Anthony. Left, we have Stefan Hanloser. Stefan, great to have you on the panel today. Stefan is Vice President of Data Protection at ProSieben Sat.1 Media Group, one of the largest media companies in Europe, for almost 12 years right now. And he is responsible for data protection from a legal perspective, but also governance perspective at ProSieben Sat.1. Welcome, Stefan. And last but not least, Rob van Eijk. Rob is the Managing Director of the Future for Privacy Forum in Europe, FPF, since the end of 2019. And before that, he worked for the Dutch DPA as a Senior Supervisor Officer and a technologist for over 10 years. Welcome, Rob. And so the panel question is privacy through innovation. And I would like to ask you, Anthony, about what does Google understand by this term, privacy through innovation?
Great. Thanks, Marek, for the question. It's good to be here. Good to see everyone. So share a couple thoughts on how we think about privacy through innovation. I think it's pretty clear, hopefully to everyone at this point, that data, is powering and has powered so much innovation in the computing space. I think this is something that's been happening for a while. But then, even more recently, sort of top of mind for many folks in the industry, of course, is the inflection point shift around artificial intelligence and machine learning, where it's clear that data, including user data and other types of data, will play an increasingly important role in powering these new innovative experiences. And I think what that has highlighted, in a way I think that's important and clear, is the need for, while we're innovating in, for example, artificial intelligence, that we also are equally focused on innovating around how we better protect and manage and handle user data. So Google, about a year ago, announced something called the Protected Computing Initiative. And really what that is an approach based around privacy enhancing technologies, or PETs as they're often referred to, that really seek to, at a technical, in a mathematical level, better protect user data, whether that's through data minimization, de-identification, restricting access to data only to the right parties. And there's, this is work that's been happening in the industry, in the academia as well for many years. Google's invested in this area as well. Technologies, differential privacy, federated learning, trusted computing enclaves, and more. And so, that's what protected computing is about. I think, maybe a couple examples I'll give of how we see, privacy enhancing technologies helping with, call it real world applications or problems that we, challenges that we face in unlocking new innovation opportunities. I think a good example is in Android, something called the private compute core. And this is a secure enclave on an Android device, isolated from the rest of the operating system and apps. And it unlocks the ability for AI-based use cases and applications, things like smart reply, spam detection in messages, intelligent keyboard autocomplete features that utilize user data for machine learning and for AI, but do so in a way that's deeply and fundamentally secure and protects user privacy and protects that data. I think that's a good example. Another example, which hopefully I'll have a chance to say a few remarks about, is Privacy Sandbox, which is the effort that I head up, which is really focused on how do we reduce and eliminate user tracking of user activities across apps and websites, while at the same time supporting important ecosystem and business and industry needs at the same time. So I think those are two examples. I think there's many more where a protected computing approach could apply. And I guess maybe last quick thought, and I'll stop, is I think often there's sometimes seen as a tension between improving user privacy and supporting innovation, use cases, utility, however you want to describe it. And I think the idea of privacy through innovation, and as part of using privacy enhancing technologies and more, is really to break through that tension and to see a way through to actually achieve both of those goals at the same time.
Thank you, Nick. You touched on a variety of topics already: protected computing, pets, the privacy sandbox, ads ecosystem. I want to take one step back on the consumer perspective. They're concerned about tracking online for advertising purpose. And another issue we're facing is a consent fatigue on the internet. And the cookie consent banners is an emerging problem everywhere. And Rob, I would like to hear your perspective on cookie banners in general and the mechanisms that are associated with the complexity about the technology behind it. What is your observation?
Well, obviously the consent problem has been around for more than a decade. I mean, we shifted in the e-privacy rules in 2009 from opt-out to opt-in. And along that timeline, GDPR consent came in, and now we have DMA consent as well. So obviously these three types of consent are not exactly the same, so they overlap. And we need to look more closely on what the effect will be, and also on which actors in the ecosystem these different types of consent apply. But from a consumer perspective, obviously the consent will not go away. I mean, we'll be bombarded in the near future as well when we install an app on first use. Maybe we get renewals of consent upon updates. If we look, for instance, to the transparency consent framework that's now being updated in the IB case in Europe, dramatic shifts in terms of the information provided on the consent layer is something new we'll see. So I think what we learned from the privacy by design lessons learned taken into account in the design of the user interface, information that's really needed for the user to understand what's the consequence of consenting, and also understanding how can I actually revoke my consent at any time that I want, and to what extent will that be carried out throughout the data value chain. I think these are important things to take into account. Consent fatigue is often used as an argument by industry to basically lower down the lowness, the level of granularity that's required. Obviously there's been a lot of pushback by complaints with the one-on-one cases by NOIP. That's one example that came up. And the CNIL came up with good guidances. We've all read through that. So if we look at the consistency of these designs, specifically on apps, because that's a challenge, the screen is really small, it's much more the two types of dialogues you'll see. The one will be truly a consent, your neutral buttons in terms of yes and no, and the others will much be more about informing a user that they got the information that's required, and that will point him to a user control, usually to opt out of certain processing. So that's, I think it will not go away, to sum up my answer to you. But we have to be careful to not over-design for consent moments throughout the user experience, because obviously if the amount of information is condensed to a level that is not clear what the effect of that consent means, then we end up in a situation where the proportionality of consent may be lost.
Thank you, Rob. You mentioned the role of industry, and this brings me to the so-called cookie pledge initiative that Commissioner Reinders announced, I think 2 months ago at the Consumer Summit, and you are leading this effort for the European Commission. Could you tell us more about what is the the objective of this cookie pledge initiative? Where do we stand right now? What are the next steps?
Thank you for the question, and good afternoon to all of you. First of all, maybe I would like to start by a context of this initiative. So it's an initiative which is led by, as you said, Commissioner Reinders, who is a member of the European Commission and is the Commissioner for Justice. And the Justice Department, DG Justice, includes also the GDPR, but also consumer protection. And so the Commissioner, after many meetings to which he participated, came to us and said, this cookie fatigue is really something which is annoying everybody, and I would like my department to reflect on what we could do to make the process much more smooth for the consumers, or even automated. So basically, his vision is that there could be a system where a consumer would set his or her preference, have his own profile, and this is of course a digital tool which then can interact with all the different requests for consent. So that was his vision, and he asked us to work on that. And one of the things we told him is maybe we should go a step backwards and think, but why are the consumers, why do they need to do that? Because it's not only for their privacy, in order to decide on their data protection preferences, but it is also because they are in a commercial context. They go on websites, they use apps, and in many cases, they don't pay. So there is no monetary exchange, but there is still some exchange. And what is the exchange in question? The exchange in question is that you, as a consumer, when you start navigating on online content, you accept to be subjected to advertisement in exchange, in consideration of the free online content. And this acceptance is not understood by most of the consumers. Why? Because in fact, this you can find it in the terms and conditions, so in what we call the small prints. But most of the time it's not explained, and the consumers, they see just the cookie banners popping up, and they have to accept something, and they don't understand. And if they are really empowered, then they will refuse, most of them, so 75% of the consumers refuse, usually when they can refuse the cookies, all the cookies, and in particular the cookies for targeted advertisement or tracking-based advertisement. So we told the Commissioner that this is really the starting base, the starting point, where we should look at if we want to start from a consumer perspective. What is exactly the business model which is proposed to the consumer? How can the consumer better understand? and also have options. It's not black and white. It's not you pay or you give us all your all this information about your navigation, so that then we can target you with advertising. There should be some alternative solutions. And so this idea, which seems very simple, in fact is transforming the perspective. So from privacy to consumer protection. And we have proposed to all the different partners in the digital advertising ecosystem to come and reflect together with us in a roundtable, which was organized end of April. And we had really a lot of participants. And now we are organizing working groups to discuss more in detail what sort of voluntary action could be adopted by the industry. And when I say the industry, is the entire digital ecosystem. So it can be advertisers, it can be technology companies, it can be companies managing consumer data in order to create profiles and so on, and publishers. And so we are discussing 3 topics. Information to the consumer about this business model and the consequences on their privacy preferences. Alternatives to tracking-based advertisement. So is, for example, contextual advertisement a solution? And finally, what are the solutions which could help the consumers automate their choices so that they don't need to repeat it each time they visit a new website or start a new app?
Thank you for this overview. Just a follow-up question. Why do you think consumers need more information on like the business model? Is it about the acceptance of their data is being processed for advertising purposes? Or what is like the adding additional information or like an additional layer of information to an already complex banner with information?
Yeah, that could seem as a paradox, because indeed it's already so complex to consent to cookies, because you can have up to 2,000 cookies to consent to if you want to do really your work correctly. It's because, in fact, something which has been forgotten is the fact that the consumers is in a commercial relationship, and it's difficult for the consumer to understand this when he or she does not need to pay something. And this is something which we have clarified in EU consumer law, that it is a commercial relationship, and so basically consumer law applies even if the transaction is not paid in money, but paid with the agreement of the consumer to receive publicity and eventually to give information about him, her, and the navigation path and other types of information. And so we think that once this is made clear to the consumer, first of all, it's compliant with consumer legislation. It has to be clear from the beginning. It should not be clear after you decided to refuse cookies and suddenly you receive a pop-up saying, oh, sorry, then you have to pay. That's not okay. It's okay you have to pay, but you need to tell the consumers before, not just after having tried to make choices for their preferences. So we think that by reversing this, the consumer will better understand in which kind of commercial context they are consuming free of monetary payment online content.
You mentioned the second working group, which is about alternatives to tracking-based advertisement. And we see like a huge shift within the entire ads ecosystem to alternatives to tracking-based advertisement. And probably, Rob, asking you with like an overview of what do you see like as a trail of direction right now in the ad tech scene? And what can we expect in the near future for solutions?
There's a lot to be said. I mean, there are many new regulatory instruments being deployed because the e-privacy regulation is still stuck. The Swedish presidency has not been very active on the file. Political advertising to minors, children, advertising by using sensitive data categories have all been regulated now. That's something that will be implemented and will trickle through the supply chain as well. I think if we look at, and I just looked through the lens of privacy engineering and e-privacy and GDPR, not consumer law, not competition law, it's interesting to see that obviously our main instrument to browse the web browser, is going to change drastically next year with the sunset of the third-party cookies. So many of the cookies that are addressed in the pledge will not exist anymore for people who use the Chrome browser. And that's interesting because here we have an opportunity to design for a different type of advertising world than we see today. Today it's based on protocols, for instance, open real-time bidding, which means you share data with relatively stable identifiers, whether it's an identifier based on your email address or your telephone number or another identifier. And that can be used to attach data about your browsing behavior, about your purchasing behavior, your buying intent, and stored in profiles, and then can be traded online with the bidding. And the problem we've seen play out in the IAB case in Belgium is that basically there's no control on who you share data with, and also not for what purpose these identifiers will be used in the future. So the future for advertising, in my view, needs to be designed with more privacy principles in mind. And obviously, through the lens of the GDPR, we have Article 5 as a great tool. I mean, if we look at the way the privacy sandbox will be composed, it will be a collection of APIs, which means much of the processing that's now taking place outside of the browser will take place on device. So anything that can be learned through machine learning and based on your interests that are derived from your web browsing history can take place there. And why do I zoom in on that? Is because it's an opportunity to zoom in on the question, what's the privacy improvement there? Well, in my view, the APIs, which are like programming interfaces, they're little doors you can open if you looked at the browser as a black box. This is where the interesting transposition of the Article 5 principles of the GDPR come into play. Things like purpose limitation. You can design the API in such a way that you can limit what you can do with the information that's stored in the browser or read information that's previously stored, read it out again. So that purpose limitation element comes hand in hand with the data minimization element, which means you can have much more control over the use of the web browsing history that takes place. And obviously the main question here, of course, is what's the default in terms of being able to learn with machine learning in the browser about my website browsing behavior? And this is where I think the privacy by default and privacy by design ideas that are locked down in Article 25 of the GDPR come into play. Because as I understand, Google is planning to deploy this with the default off. So you have to consent. You have to really, this will be based on informed consent. And this is just one of the things that in the near future may come to exist. But obviously, the advertising model is one aspect, interest-based. We have other advertising models out there as well, remarketing, for example. And it's interesting to better understand what the APIs are, part of that solution that Google is going to offer. And obviously, for advertisers, it's very important to be able to not just select the audience they want to show an ad to and to make a value proposition, but also understand in terms of frequency and reach, whether they spend their money wisely. And the privacy improvement opportunity there is to use privacy-enhanced technologies, such as adding noise, to basically diffuse a little bit the accuracy. So the setback in terms of the future of advertising will be that it's much less accurate. It's not what we've seen, the disproportionate nature of the third-party cookie, that needs to go away. And obviously, working with data derived from web browsing behavior and visiting websites from brands that have something to sell, the opportunity there is to use these pads wisely. And this is where I think the near future will lay. Yeah.
Thank you. I would like to bring in the industry perspective and Stefan, you into the conversation. Since you, as the data protection professional working for one of the largest media companies in Europe, you are facing these questions every day, and you also, see the shift of the ecosystem. Can you describe, from your professional industry perspective, the change that Rob just described? How do you see this changing ecosystem? What does it mean for ProSieben, Sat.1 Media, and how do you prepare for the future that Rob just described?
How do we prepare for the future? So, of course, we are following the discussion about cookies, cookie pledge initiatives, maybe some words, and it somehow describes how we are preparing for the future on these three elements. So, I've just learned from you that informing the user about the commercial background, about the commercial dependencies behind a website, behind an online service. So, of course, we have always asked to inform the users about the commercial need to monetize the inventory, to pay for the content costs, and therefore you need money, and you need to make money if you have an ad-sponsored business through selling the inventory, through selling ad space on your website. So therefore, it's very important to emphasize that there is kind of a deal between the user and those providing content, reliable content. This needs to be financed. However, we have been through this already. So in Germany, for instance, and it started in Austria with Der Standard, a newspaper, which directly offers either you give consent or you pay. So this is crystal clear. So exactly what you are asking for, that the user sees, either I pay, or as an alternative to paying €3 or so, I give full consent. But this, so you can't want more. So if any user who is interested or who wants to know about the economic background or the economic reason for why consent is requested for cookies and data processing can easily see that this is the alternative to paying €3. So it can't be clearer. However, this has been challenged by the Austrian Data Protection Authority, so the standard model. So exactly what you're proposing has already been challenged by a very important European Data Protection Authority. This is the first point. To the second point, alternatives to tracking. So the old discussion, why don't you move to contextual? Why are you sticking to targeted advertising? So first of all, the discussion is not about financing through advertising. So this is not the point. So users understand that that the ads they see is the basis for the content to pay the journalists and so on, all the producers, all the content behind a website. This is clear. It's about the targeting aspect as opposed to contextual, non-data processing, cookieless alternatives. So therefore, when we come to the question of targeted advertising, the alternative of contextual, it's very simple. So, of course, there are many statistics out there which claim that you can make the same amount of money and that an inventory sold on the basis of contextual advertising can be sold as well and as well monetized like any targeted. It's simply not true. So, therefore, there is a certain need to in the existing ecosystem, and this is back to your question, what we are discussing and trying to find other solutions all the time, is that for the time being, it's very simple. Simply economically speaking, the price for a targeted advertising or a targeted inventory is far higher than for a simply contextual offer. And on automation, it's also a big discussion. So what does it mean, automation? So on the one hand, we say that consent, as opposed to legitimate interest or any other forms of legal basis for processing data, that we should move to consent to empower the user to decide whether data should be processed or not. So consent is the choice. But this would also require, and the lawmaker, just in all the digital acts we see now, so Digital Governance Act relies on consent, DMA relies on consent, DSA and so on, we have consent. Consent is always the lawmaker's choice, But then we have the complaints that it becomes too difficult, that users are not in a position to understand, and so on. So this is homemade, but it's made by the lawmaker, and then it's up to the industry is asked to resolve this problem. So if we rely on consent as the central basis to legitimize data processing or all different other actions depending on consent, then we also need a solution how this consent could be collected, compliant with the requirements and valid. And therefore, when it comes to automation, my question would be, who decides? So we know the discussion about PIMS, personal information management systems. We have a paragraph in the German Telecommunications, Telemedia Data Protection Act already for personal information management for cookie setting, but it's extremely difficult. Who decides? So if it's automated, then you somehow transfer the decision. So you're right to decide, and you as the individual, your decision to a blacklist curated by somebody else? Would this be or who decides to take this automated decision whether to grant consent to this specific website? Is this a reliable publisher or not? Who decides, if not you, in each individual case? So you could say, okay, I simply import the list of this non-for-profit organization, and if this non-for-profit organization classifies this website as reliable and worth consent, then I grant consent. But this means somehow transferring your individual right, your privacy right, to a third party, to whatever white or black list, and therefore automation is very difficult since in all those models we have been looking at, back to your question, what we are doing all the time, all these models, they shift the individual's decision about this fundamental privacy right to another organization providing black or white lists or automating in a whatever way. So therefore it's dangerous. So therefore automation would be hesitant. So I think it goes all back to the core, and this is consent the right instrument for enabling data processing and so on, or should we have other like legitimate interest or whatever?
I think the example of the pure model you mentioned clearly shows that like publishers need some source to finance the content they produce, right? Even if it's like someone paying €3 in your example, or someone consents to the data is being processed for advertising. And in this context, Rob, you mentioned the privacy sandbox, an industry-wide project, but it was initiated by Google. And you mentioned some of the APIs. And I'm not sure if everyone is aware of like the privacy sandbox initiative and how it works. And so my next question goes to you, Anthony, about, so how does Google think about a web without third-party cookies? And in this context, can you explain like, the fundamental principles of this privacy sandbox initiative?
Yeah, no, I'll try my best to describe it. Look, when we think about the world, sort of the web, the internet, without third-party cookies, I think at the core level it boils down to a belief that privacy, user privacy, and open access to information is something that should be universal, right? Accessible to all users across the world. And I would sort of maybe, I think the contrast of that would be a world where either to have your data kept private, it's sort of a luxury good, you have to pay for it, or to access information, right? To be able to access the richness and diversity of the web is also something that becomes, more restricted, and there's less vibrancy and less diversity and flourishing of content that we see in the internet today that makes the internet, the amazing resource that it is. So I think, that's really, I think the core of the vision. And so the question is, how do we get there, right? Privacy and access to information, universal, sounds good. I think, an approach we've seen and, certainly thought about is, I'll describe it as sort of a blunt approach where it's effectively restricting, the existing, let's call it prevalent mechanisms like third-party cookies, blocking them or restricting them in some type of way. And I think what we've seen and heard feedback from, the ecosystem very clearly is that approach actually fails on both dimensions that we care about. One, it certainly harms publishers. Like we're just now talking about how do publishers and content creators like fund their business. So it has challenges there. But we think it also fails from a privacy perspective as well, because without viable alternative solutions for these critical ecosystem and industry use cases, it actually just drives growth of what I'll call worse forms of tracking, right? Covert tracking, device fingerprinting, moving to identifiers that are perhaps less resettable and less controllable for users. So to your question, Marek, I think Privacy Sandbox, our belief and approach that we're working on and taking is that we need to develop new privacy-enhancing technologies that don't rely upon cross-site identifiers, including third-party cookies that can afford basically unrestricted collection of user data tied to a user identifier. And those technologies need to support these important ecosystem use cases. Rob touched on some of them with interest-based advertising, being able to utilize first-party relationships and audiences to serve relevant ads across the internet, measure the effectiveness of ads, and more. So that's the approach that we're taking with Privacy Sandbox. Again, our goal is to enable a web without third-party cookies, but that is private, more private for users, but also where access to information is universal and available to everyone.
Thank you. Marie-Paule, is the wish of consumers not to be tracked, but also get access to online information, is that a paradox?
No, I don't think there is a paradox. I think that the users, as the colleague from ProSieben said, they understand that free online content, or it was the same before, a free newspaper or a cheap newspaper, because in the past, if you had to pay the full price of a newspaper, nobody could really ever purchase it. So also in the past, this is financed by publicity. So I think that what the consumers do not want, and we have recent data which we published also very recently, the consumers, they don't want that their data, and when they think about their data, it's very large. It's not only their names, email address, it's also what they do is traded in a way which they cannot control and which they see perfectly that it is traded because they see the results in the publicity they receive. Everybody sees that, you've been to this place and now you receive an email or a publicity which reflects something which you did. So this they don't want. But they agree to this business model, and I think they would prefer it. And I agree with Anthony that they should not be too speed. The rich people that can register to many different content and pay for it, and the rest who are forced. They have no choice, in fact, than accepting this transaction, which is the transaction of giving out a certain amount of information. So this is what we are saying. There should be some alternatives, and there we can continue. And if we have the alternative, we can continue our model, which is a deeply rooted model on the freedom of the people, on the sorry, I forgot the name, but it is a fundamental right of people for privacy. And so this is why we have put in place this consent model. The problem is that the consent, because of the economic imperatives, cannot be given in a free manner at the moment. And this is against the legislation. So to transform this, we have to give more power to the consumers and not less power, more power. And this is a complete change of approach, then we move to purpose limitation type of legislation. But this is going to be much more let's say, strict, because this and this and this is going to be forbidden. And so this is not very good for innovation, and it's not in the current principles that we have adopted in the European Union now for years. So the only solution is really give back the power to people that the people had in the past when they were paying something. Now they don't pay, most of them don't pay, and they don't want to pay. So we have to resolve this paradox. One of the things I wanted to say about the question of the revenues, I think that we should differentiate the revenues from publishers or ad companies from the revenues from advertisers. Because at the end of the day, the advertisers are paying. And so what sort of revenues are they getting from their investment in publicity? Are we sure that the current model is bringing the best results? I'm not sure, and I don't think that we have the data to decide that. But of course, when you can ask more for a targeted publicity, as a publisher or as an ad company, you get more money. So it's true that there is here a difficulty in the economic relation. And it's a two-sided market. So basically, on one side, you have an intermediary, which is placing the publicity on a consumer in exchange of free content, okay? But the real economic decision and the competition elements, they are B2B or P2P or P2 platform to traders, and you have plenty of intermediaries in this relationship, which makes the economic let's say model quite difficult to assess, and which create, in my view, some difficulties in moving in promoting innovations, because we are stuck in a certain model, and it's very difficult to move out to something more innovative, which would be better accepted by the consumers.
There's definitely the challenge between balancing, the rights of the individual, fundamental rights, but also the need for companies to monetize their content. And from a regulatory perspective, Rob, how do you think may DPAs, who as data protection authorities who are enforcing privacy laws, how they may balance these different aspects we just heard? Do you see anything that emerges, or anything that comes to your mind when you think about looking at the future? How can they balance these different?
Obviously, I cannot talk on behalf of the DPAs, but if I look at the guidance that's been provided on consent and online behavioral advertising, it's very clear what consent means in the digital age and in the current online advertising space. I think it's good to keep in mind that last year the Commission actually published the Declaration on the European Digital Rights and Principles, because they capture, in my view, pretty well how to design technology around humans. I mean, just a few elements out of that declaration that stand out to me. And the first one that really resonates is putting people at the center. I mean, it's part of the privacy paradigm, and consent basically leads to what's the default for this type of processing, for the monetization of your web browsing history. I mean, it's not consent for a reason. It's historically where we ended up with. So freedom of choice is another important element when we talk about the future of advertising. And obviously with consent, informed consent, transparency about the use of algorithms and AI, which will be applied to advertising as well, is going to be super important. And I'll give you one example of where AI is going to be an interesting role, and this is A/B testing. So A/B testing is a type of technology within advertising to understand how people react to the position of a button or the color on a screen. And typically this is done by statistics. But can you imagine whether this is going to be powered by AI and by transformative models? What we end up with is a new risk that's not been explored well yet, which is like hyper nudging. And we will see nudging on a very different level as we've seen today. And The reason why it's important to think this through a little bit more in the future is that in the Netherlands, under the cookie law, the transposition in Dutch law, A/B testing has been exempted from consent requirement. It's presumed to be a processing of personal data under the GDPR. But it's important to keep in mind that as this technology develops, new risks may occur, and that we have to think through whether the technologies that we design are fit for purpose as well in this near future. So to continue adding machine learning and AI to advertising, obviously it's important that the data sets on which these algorithms are trained are free of discrimination and enable human supervision of outcomes affecting people. Technologies should ensure that the algorithms are not used to predetermine people's choices. So this is what we, for instance, saw play out in the CNIL guidance for cookies. I mean, if you add an accept all button on the first layer, you need to have a deny all button as well. There should not be predetermined choices in there regarding browsing habits. And I also want to mention the right to include control on how the data are used and with whom they are shared as one of the important principles that stand out in this declaration. And adding an important eighth principle that I think is missing from the declaration is what about the privacy by default? We briefly touched on contextual versus machine learning in the browser. And I want to push back a little bit on the business model of consent, of contextual, because when I talk to the people that run campaigns in the Netherlands, which are run by Ster, the numbers that they come with is that their business model is actually more profitable than the interest-based model they've seen before. And the only thing they've changed is instead of assigning a unique identifier to each individual user, they just zero out the real-time bidding ID for all users. So it doesn't matter who you are. You just show in the exchange where the bid is done, you will be based on context. And contextual obviously does not work for everyone. It works for publishers with a lot of content. And for instance, in the Netherlands, we do not dub as you do in Germany. Everything is already with subtitles. So the whole video archive becomes a huge data source for natural language programming and to derive context, even in real time, on when somebody is viewing something. So there are opportunities there. And to add a second example, the Knobler network in Norway is also very successful with the contextual model. It's an alternative model to the models that Google is proposing in the privacy sandbox. I mean, the Topics API and the Protected Audience API have their own purposes, but it's for the publishers at the end to decide how to reach their audience, and maybe some parts of that audience can well be reached through contextual as well. So I think it's even for the publishers, we may go to a future where more choice for them is available as well to capitalize the relationship with their audience.
I'd like to shift a bit to the role of technology within this conversation. And Stefan, from your experience speaking about privacy-enhancing technologies like anonymization of personal data, is these kinds of technologies, may these be the solution to combine different interests like commercial interest, public interest, individual interest on privacy?
Sure, of course. So first of all, I think it's important, as you call it, PETs, PETs, however. So privacy-enhancing technologies are privacy-enhancing methods and mechanisms. It's not new. So I think in GDPR, it's already a requirement to have privacy by design, privacy by default. And for me, privacy-enhancing methods are more or less privacy by design in the end. So it starts out with the GDPR. It's already the DNA of privacy law in Europe to have privacy-enhancing methods, technologies, however, as part of your development cycle for digital products. So it's not new, but in terms of chances and risks, I think, of course, the chance is obvious. The less data you process, data processing data is a liability to an extent. It's regulated, therefore you would avoid it to the extent possible. The process data, its cost, its complexity, and so on. Second, from a publisher's perspective, so looking at Sandbox or other initiatives, of course, if you, for the time being, you are sharing or feeding much data, many data into the ecosystem, why would you do this? So the publisher is the last mile to the user. The publisher has the data, the publisher has the relationship to the users. It's the publisher who receives the data from the user. So therefore, why should this, economically speaking, why should a publisher share this data with the whole ecosystem and enabling many, many players in the ecosystem to run their own business based on data, which goes back to an online service or content provided by a publisher. So therefore, any PET which restricts the data sharing into the ecosystem, of course, is in principle welcome. When it comes to the risks of PETs, so first of all, it's a multiplayer ecosystem. So you can't start with PETs, privacy enhancing technology, on your own if you are part of such a big ecosystem where everybody with interfaces and so on, where other players in the ecosystem rely on a certain data flow to contribute to the ecosystem. Therefore, any W3C initiative like the Sandbox, which is not unilateral but multilateral, is of course welcome as well. But still, it needs to be adopted by the whole industry, otherwise it won't work. And another risk we see is, of course, are we going from bad, some would say it's bad, from bad to worse? So since in the end, are we creating new intermediaries, no new middle person who control the market? So looking at, for instance, topics, who defines the topics categories, or who allows a collector of topics to collect those topics from the user's device. So there are new edtech players which might get a totally different role under this new topics regime, or the protected audience regime when creating interest groups. So these are new players which it's a shift in the whole power system of the ecosystem, and therefore we should also have a look at whether these new technologies, these PETs, like the automation of decision, of giving consent, does this create new platforms, new intermediaries which step between the users and the publishers and get a very powerful role? You mentioned it, two-sided markets, so two-sided platforms, scaling their power, and this is the same with topics and protected audiences. Will we be giving to certain ed tech providers, DSPs, SSPs, a new role which will enable them to control the market? Since they have access to the topics, they have access to the interest groups, and step between publishers and their users.
Thanks. You mentioned the Privacy Sandbox, and Anthony, maybe you would like to respond and also to explain specifically the privacy enhancing technologies that are applied in the Privacy Sandbox and how it works.
Yeah, sure thing. I'll try to address I think some of the couple of points you brought up, at least on Privacy Sandbox, and then maybe describe a little bit of how some of the technology works. Rob actually hit on some of it earlier as well, which is great. Look, I think just taking a step back, right? If we look at, and to be honest, I think listening to the panel, and I've spent a few days in Brussels and many discussions with partners and different folks in the ecosystem. You can sense the constrainedness of the problem space, right? Like, you move this way, it's a challenge. You don't move, it's also problematic because the current status quo is not good. We need to move from it. And so I think, kind of looking at it from a technologist, I'll admit, sort of a technology point of view, an engineering point of view, it's, how do we break through what in some sense sometimes I think feels like a bit of an impasse on how we move things forward and support what's clearly better user privacy, support an ecosystem, support businesses, all of those matter. So I think from a Privacy Sandbox perspective specifically, we do think it's imperative to move away certainly from platform-provided pervasive identifiers in the form of third-party cookies. We're very clear and committed on our plan to phase out third-party cookies in Chrome in the second half of next year. I think, though, as we do that, as I touched on earlier, do you think that browsers and I'll call it consumer computing platforms, browsers, operating systems, have a responsibility to provide the building blocks and tools for the ecosystem for critical use cases? And yes, digital advertising, interest-based advertising, we think is one of those use cases that's important. I will say, I think acknowledge, and having spent a lot of time talking with companies in the ad tech space, it is a complex shift, right? This is 22-decade-old technology that we're talking about in the form of cookies, and moving away from it is not a simple thing. It's a super complicated problem, and I think that's why we're very much committed to taking an open, collaborative approach. There is lots of debate, right? When we talk to folks, you can hear some of the different perspectives on this stage as well too. One thing I do want to reiterate, it's important, I think what Stefan raised, is as we add these new capabilities, these new building blocks, platform APIs, topics, and protected audience, you've heard mentioned, and deliver that in Chrome, and hopefully working with other browsers in the future, that we absolutely have a responsibility to make sure that that's done in a way that is fair, transparent, open, and accessible. So we are fully committed at the deepest possible level, and from a compliance perspective as well, to ensure that the APIs, for example, that we introduced in Privacy Sandbox topics, for example, work exactly the same for all callers and all parties, and that there's no special access or special privileges to data for any specific party, including Google's ads business. So just wanted to be super, super clear about that, and we've said this publicly multiple times, because I understand the concern that can be raised as we sort of shift where stuff happens in the ecosystem.
No, but no, this was not my point. So of course, nobody would assume that Google takes some privileged role or so, but it's a simple reality, or it's a simple truth that if you rely for these topic callers, so the topic caller, the value of a topic caller depends on the amount of websites where this topic caller, this ad tech provider is implemented in. Since then, this topic caller will have as many topics as possible. So therefore, it's a matter of scale. So the big ad players will have a big advantage in topics, since they will have a large amount of topics from these topic categories in comparison to smaller ones. And I'm not complaining also, it's just asking about risks. So we need to keep in mind that even privacy-enhancing technologies might have a certain impact, and this impact might be negative, or at least critical. But without privileging anybody also. It's all fair and so on, but size matters in this regard, and it's part of the topic. No, Christian?
Would you like to...
Yeah, just a quick thought. No, thank you for sharing that. I actually agree. And I think you're talking about, so understand, I think what I would say is, you're right, in privacy-enhancing technology, any particular API, we have to think deeply about utility and privacy. And so the feature you're describing, which is I think probably very specific, maybe audience that fully following, about exactly the details of who we release these topics to, right, from a caller perspective. Yes, it's massively less data than today, is conditioned on the caller having had the potential to see this topic, right, based on presence on for example, on a different publisher website. And so you're right, that's one of the design decisions that we made to basically keep the privacy properties strong, still provide strong utility. But yes, I think all of these design decisions have consequences, and something that needs to be discussed openly. And so thank you for bringing that up.
We're speaking about privacy-enhancing technologies, and specifically in the ads ecosystem. But I would like to zoom out a bit of this, and we have Christian here. And thanks for your patience. Now, yes, exactly. Great that you're here, and you are actually the pen holder of the OECD report of emerging privacy-enhancing technologies. And we would like to learn about what was the motivation for this report. What are the results? Could you share with this audience?
Yes, sure. So thank you very much, and also thank you very much for inviting us to basically also talk about our report. And it's true indeed that our work actually goes beyond advertisement and actually covers like issues related to the use of pets in the health sector, in finance, and even go, I would say, towards the use of pets for, let's say, the protection of non-personal data as well, which is an interesting case. And I would say in order to understand why we worked on this, I think it's also important to see that essentially 3 points. One, it was important to us at the OECD, since actually we started working on pets in 2002, to kind of highlight that technology can essentially be part of the solution and not necessarily always is a part of the problem. And this was, and is still today a key, I would say, a key message that we see we need to convey to policymakers, which is also why we're happy to be here, because obviously the title is Privacy Through Innovation. The second motivation of our work was that we basically were happy to be able to bring to the G20 countries and leaders, and as well as to the G7 leaders, the concept of privacy-enhancing technologies. So for those of you who have followed the discussion, you will note that privacy-enhancing technology actually prominently put and highlighted in the G7 statement since 2020. Now, this is on one hand a reason to celebrate. On the other hand, it actually we noted actually some major concerns, and this was essentially that some, let's say, actors started celebrating that, hurrah, now with privacy-enhancing technologies, we actually have solved the cross-border data flow problem. We have solved the privacy problem of the world. And I think this is why, Stefan, your point about the risk and the challenges, I think is always important. And our work was also aimed to kind of demystify the potential of privacy-enhancing technologies. And lastly, what we wanted to convey is what are the barriers to adoption? So yes, we see the value in privacy-enhancing technologies. We see also the limitations. And knowing that, yes, privacy regulation play an important role. It's not only about privacy as being a key element. So you have issues related to education. You have issues related to competition playing also an important role. You have issues related to intellectual property playing a role. So the wide range of issues that we need to consider as we talk about privacy-enhancing technology is actually wider than just privacy and even consumer protection. And this was also one of the, I would say, one of the motivation of our work.
Thank you. Could you elaborate more on the implications specifically from this global perspective that you have, specifically on privacy and consumer protection?
Yes, I'm happy indeed to do that. I would say, and this was maybe also one of the important insights of our work, very often, and I've been in quite a number of privacy-enhancing technology-related events, and very often we note that people tend to talk about privacy-enhancing technologies as if it was like one category of thing. And the reality is it's really different. And one of the, I would say, to make a little bit the connection to the previous discussion, one of the interesting elements that I see when it comes to the Google's privacy sandbox is that it actually nicely shows that in order to be effective, you need to combine different types of privacy-enhancing technology. It's not only about one type, it's actually the combination of the different types that really matter. So this is one of the important lessons learned. And I won't bother you with the different categories of privacy-enhancing technologies that we looked at. Either you do know, and then you will be bought by my intervention, or you don't know, and I won't be able to really convey to you in a minute. But maybe to highlight one important point, and I think this is indeed a very important one that, as I was also talking to some of the participants, I think another element to recognize is that it also depends, when you talk about the benefits of privacy-enhancing technologies, it actually also depends on what is our concept that we have of privacy. I don't want to be philosophical, but obviously there is this notion of confidentiality being an important one. And depending if this is your primary target, you will have certain types of privacy-enhancing technology that do play an important role. If the concept that you are focusing on is more towards, let's say, self-determination, autonomy, agency, then different types of privacy-enhancing technology do play an important role here as well. And I think this is actually one of the interesting points that is often also not considered.
Thank you. Most important questions, where can we get this report?
I mean, obviously, if you Google, pun not intended,
Or use any other
Or use any other.
search engine
Exactly.
of your choice.
You will find us essentially on the website of the OECD, and there is specifically, if you look at emerging privacy-enhancing technologies. But obviously, feel free also to contact me.
Thank you. I would like to go a bit deeper soon, but you mentioned privacy sandbox and the combination of different privacy-enhancing technologies. And maybe this goes to you, Anthony, since you are the engineer here. Can you explain to this audience how does like privacy sandbox really work, like from a pet's perspective?
Yeah.
Like what technology is actually applied?
How much time do we have? So no, just kidding.
5 minutes.
I think you should hit the key thing. I'll try to keep it high level and just sort of get the essential concepts across. I'll maybe take something like, actually, since I think Rob touched on topics, and we just chatted about topics API, a little bit about protected audience. One of the APIs, this is by way of kind of explaining how we do this. One of the core use cases for marketers and therefore for publishers in the ecosystem is the ability to measure performance of online ads, right? The user seen an ad. By the way, this is true even if the ad is contextual versus an interest-based or sort of personalized ad. The measurement is actually very, very core for folks familiar with ad tech ecosystem. So the challenge today is that largely this is done through cross-site identifiers like third-party cookies or device identifiers on mobile, and they do afford effectively, again, unrestricted access to effectively a user's browsing history, sites they've seen, things they've done on the website that are tracked through conversion tags and things of that nature. And so how do we do much better from a privacy perspective through a purpose-built API that fundamentally limits data? So first, what we enable is companies to be able to kind of solve the core problem, right, that they need with attribution measurement, which is I ran a marketing campaign. What is the associated return on that ad spend, right, from a conversions perspective? And so, again, without getting into all the technical detail, what we do is we basically constrain. We have the browser basically process the data, make it much more privacy safe, right? So rather than returning, here's every single website and conversion that basically a user has done, and then ad tech goes and has all that data now and does the processing on the back end, we do more of that processing on the browser. So it's an example of on-device processing. We also have parts of our solutions that rely upon data processing in a secure cloud enclave that basically has technical guarantees that the user level data will never leave that enclave. It's basically technically enforced. That's technology, one of the pet technologies. And then to Christian's point actually about it's a combination of technologies. It turns out that you need to use a bunch of these. Another thing we do is apply differential privacy frameworks to the data. So it is important for users or for marketers and for ad tech companies to be able to understand, like the specific products that were sold, associated, or purchased based upon a marketing campaign. But we need to do so in a way that basically, think about it as aggregates the data, coarsifies it, adds noise, applying noise in a thoughtful way as another sort of pet technique that we use to basically, when I describe it, summarize it, is massively reduce the amount of data that is made available and basically de-identifies and removes the ability for user activity across sites and apps to be linked using this purpose-built attribution reporting API. There's a lot of technical detail behind it. Actually, we publish all of our designs on GitHub in a very transparent way. We get lots of feedback from stakeholders across the ecosystem that's led us to adjust and evolve and change the designs over time, over the past few years that we've been working on the project. But yeah, hopefully that gives a sense of how we approach the problem.
Yeah, I think as you can see, it's really, really complicated to explain it to users. And so if you apply privacy-enhancing technologies, Stefan, for example, how do you actually explain these technologies to users?
It's still okay to answer the question, of course. How do you explain privacy-enhancing technologies. So, interesting question. So, ideally, if the privacy-enhancing technology works well, there is no need to explain anything under Article 13 GDPR, since you're not processing data. It was a test. No, this is the answer in my view. So it's the basis of privacy-enhancing technologies is that you process less data, therefore you would have to disclose less. So of course you can advertise that you're using privacy-enhancing technologies, but usually you are disclosing if you process data, and privacy-enhancing technologies prevent the processing of data, and therefore reduce your information duties under GDPR.
So then, what are the major barriers for applying or investing in general into privacy-enhancing technologies? Do you have any insights, Christian, from your report?
Yes, indeed. And I would say it really depends which side of the, let's say, of the market you are looking at. So, I mean, I'm a computer scientist and an economist by education. And there you basically tend to divide markets by demand side and supply side. So if you look at the supply side of privacy-enhancing technologies, one of the things that we noted is that definitely one of the challenges is that developing privacy-enhancing technologies, and this is true really across the board, is actually relatively expensive. I don't know how many man-hours actually is behind the sandbox. I personally would be curious to learn that, but it's clear that it's not insignificant. And therefore, we see also countries, let's say, putting money on the table by providing support for R&D and research and development in this particular area. But then you have, as I said, the more the demand side, which is essentially the side of the users. And there, one of the challenges, because this is a question that I often hear, is like, does regulation actually prohibit or encourage the use of privacy-enhancing technologies? And there it's really, I would say, depends in the sense that we noted, and this is documented in the literature as well as through our interactions with users, that one of the challenges is essentially related to the legal uncertainty that exists. And that's why, from an OECD perspective, we actually very much welcome some of the initiatives, such as from the ICO, but also other data protection authorities that have put in place or presented guidances on how to effectively and appropriately use privacy-enhancing technologies. But as I pointed to, it's much more broader than that, because you have elements regarding skills. I think one of the challenges, and obviously from an OECD and policymakers' perspective, you care not only about the big companies, which probably have the resources to deploy and to use privacy-enhancing technologies the right way, but you actually also care about the small and medium-sized enterprises, which don't necessarily have the resources. And there we see indeed a problem, not only in terms of awareness raising, because a number of firms don't necessarily know that these kind of technologies exist, but even if they would know, they don't necessarily have the in-house capacity to put those technologies into place in a way that is not only like we have adopted PPTs, but also in a way that actually is effective in the sense that it really effectively protects the interests and the rights of the customers. So I would say, I don't want to direct people to the report, but I think we have done quite significant research there. And maybe one thing to say is essentially that it also depends a lot on the specific use case. Advertisement is an important one, obviously, but we are also looking into the use of pets in the health sector, in finance, as I said, in manufacturing. And there you also have, let's say, sector-specific challenges that you need to consider. And maybe an interesting one for the audience is actually let's say, the interplay between different types of regulations, where, yes, privacy and data protection plays an important role, but also financial market regulation. And sometimes we see some interference, let's say, between the two when it comes to the use of privacy-enhancing technologies.
Thank you so much. I think we're at time, is that correct? Oh, I see. Okay, so questions? Very quick.
I'll try to be very... Is this working? Oh, okay, great. Christian, thank you very much for raising the point of privacy as confidentiality and privacy as autonomy, because I think that is crucial in this discussion. And in particular when Anthony framed Privacy Sandbox as something that encourages innovation and industry. I think it's important to also hear another framing that actually suggests that Privacy Sandbox can be used as a tool to legitimize something that is obviously legitimate, like which we're talking about Google Display Network as it is right now. And I was just curious to hear Rob's opinion actually about this. Do you think that Privacy Sandbox actually solves the issue that is the core issue of privacy in this discussion? So the alternatives of the tracking, what Google proposes.
It does clearly solve many of the problems we see today. It doesn't, for sure, not solve all problems. And I think the key thing to keep in mind is that it's opt-in for the topics API. So it will be off by default. And for the protected audience, it's also good to keep in mind that it's quite similar to what we see with tags at the moment. You get an empty container. So the big win here is that when HTML5 was introduced, we got local storage. We got the local database. Now we get new APIs, and you have to request, you have to start initiating a communication with these APIs. So to sum up, from a policy perspective, I think it's important to understand what the default is. When does the processing of personal data start, but also what's the sphere that's being protected. The browser space obviously has a parameter that's protected by e-privacy rules. And from the technological point of view, restricting access to the API to data with APIs, I think is a tremendous step forward in trying to limit the disproportionate use of identifiers we've seen before. So we can go many different directions. We can go contextual. We can go to like Google's offer. You can also go to more like the telcos are offering. They're injecting identifiers based on your telephone number outside of the browser, so it's much more difficult. So it's a nuanced answer because it's complex.
Any other questions? Thanks so much for your questions. Thank you so much for everyone on the panel for this conversation. There's so much more to discuss. We will continue. Have a great day, and thank you so much.